So welcome back to this study that I'm doing on sex, sexuality and gender in the Old Testament. Yesterday I did the introduction, and today I'll be sharing with you part one, which is called Genesis and Gender. And I want to begin by looking at a few short passages from Genesis. Genesis 1 verses 26 and 27, chapter 2 verse 7, verses 23 and 25, and chapter 5 verses 1 and 2. And I want to look at these verses particularly because they use some basic Hebrew words that might help us get inside the minds of Hebrew-speaking people from the days when these scriptures were written down. And I think they might also help us get some sense of the ancient cultural understanding of what we now might call sex, sexuality and gender, and get inside some of the thinking of what that looked like at the time. Now, before we get into any of the finer details, I think it's really important to recognise that all Hebrew nouns have a gender, and they're the standard, possibly old-fashioned options of male and female, just like they do in French. So sometimes in Hebrew we're literally looking at the story of a man and a woman. Sometimes we are looking at a pair of objects that happen to be labelled as male or female because of this quirk in the language. And sometimes we have ambiguities that lie between those two. And this sometimes causes confusion. For example, when the name of a species or a group of animals has a gender. And of course, those species contain examples of both male and female. So you can imagine that can get quite complicated. And there are many other areas where this male-female language thing gets a lot more complicated. So, what better place to start a study of sex and gender and sexuality in the Old Testament than with Adam? Most people know Adam as the name of the first man in the Bible. But if you don't already know, then you will soon find out that Hebrew is rarely quite so straightforward as that. Adam is also a word for man. And in the text of Genesis, Adam is interchanged for meaning humanity, generic man, or a specific man named Adam, and it changes this without warning or explanation. Yet these are not what we would call homonyms. They're not discrete differences of meaning like the bark of a tree or the bark of a dog. They're essentially the same word, but used in a different context, sometimes to a slightly different effect and sometimes to a significantly different effect. As a result, it's often not being clear which meaning of the word Adam is being used at any one time. This is an ambiguity that has stayed with us from the birth of civilization right up to the moon landings, when Neil Armstrong spoke of one small step for man, or possibly a man, as he argues, and a giant leap for mankind. And so different translators of the Bible have made different decisions about when Adam means humanity, when it means the people, and when it means a man, or when it means the person Adam. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible chooses to draw at least one hard line on this issue. When Adam is prefixed with ha, which means the NRSV never translates it as the name Adam. This makes sense as it's quite unusual to prefix any name with the. I'd be unlikely to call myself the Pete. However, this of course leaves us with an interesting dilemma in the translation. In the NRSV, we are not introduced to the name Adam until Genesis 4:25, where he and his wife have a third child called Seth. In this translation, Adam and Eve don't share a single verse of the Bible until we reach the Apocrypha in Tobit 8 verse 6. And that verse reads, "You made Adam, and for him you made his wife Eve as a helper and support." Whenever Eve is mentioned in Genesis, it's alongside Ha-Adam, the man. This makes Eve the first named human in the NRSV. But whenever Adam is named as a person in that translation without the ha, Eve is not named but referred to as his wife. But for now, let's go back to Genesis 1:27. where the singular masculine noun Adam is used in a peculiar piece of grammatical acrobatics to represent all of humanity. Genesis 1:27 reads as follows: So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. The text switches from a singular him to a plural them without warning, referring in the plural back to the singular Adam as being created both male and female. That inclusion of genders is pre-echoed linguistically in the first part of verse 26, when Adam is created in the image, masculine, plural, and likeness, feminine, singular, of us. Genesis chapter 5 verses 1 and 2 reiterate this notion of Adam containing both masculine and feminine. But here in chapter 5 we have a much clearer sense of Adam, though singular, being described as a plural them. And in chapter 5 verse 2 there is a clear sense of God naming both the masculinity and the femininity of people as Adam. So this is the most literal translation that I can manage of these two verses. This is the book of feminine generations of Adam, in days when God created Adam in the feminine image of God. He made them, male and female he created them, and he blessed them and called them Adam in days when he created them. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 we may also note that Adam, the male noun, has an interesting linguistic relationship with the ground from which he is made. Adamah, ground, the feminine version of that same noun, Adam. And so Adam is most clearly linguistically male in Hebrew in relationship to the femininity of the fertile ground, rather than to an individual human woman. So whilst Adam refers only to humans and in general to males, there is no linguistic feminine counterpart to the word Adam. The Hebrew word Adam turns up in various forms 589 times, yet Eve is surprisingly only mentioned twice by name in the Old Testament. They're in Genesis chapter 3 verse 20 and chapter 4 verse 1. Even more strangely, Adam and Eve, as individually named humans, don't really enter into that second creation story in the Garden of Eden, beginning at Genesis 2:4. Adam in that story is Ha-Adam, the man, human or humanity, and she is actively named woman. In chapter 2 verse 23 it says, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And it's not until the end of that story that Ha-Adam seems to give her a new name, which is Eve. She then has that one mention in Tobit chapter 8 verse 6 and two more mentions in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 3 and 1 Timothy 2 verse 13. Her name sounds like the word for to bow down or worship, but also sounds a little bit like the old root of the verb to live. It's unclear to what extent her name is meant to be about giving life and how much it's about being subservient to perhaps her man or perhaps more likely to God. Eve's role in Old Testament language is limited, but Adam runs deeply through the language. There is a level of that we have not yet explored. If Adam is from Adamah, then it follows that Dam, which means blood, is from Adam. Although linguistically speaking, it's likely that Dam predates Adam, and therefore it's more likely that etymologically Adam comes from Dam. Nevertheless, the relationship between the words and their meanings is real and deep. Genesis chapter 9 verse 6 gives us some significant theology that we will explore in more detail later in connection to Leviticus, but for now let's just explore how these two words interact in this verse. The opening verb here is a participle, so a literal half translation might be shedding the dam of Adam by Adam, his dam will be shed. To get a visual sense of the Hebrew mindset on the relationship between blood and Adam, let's just look at the symmetry of that opening statement from Genesis 9 verse 6. Blood and consequence flow outward from Adam. Dam is a masculine noun, just as Adam is a masculine noun. This relationship throws further doubt over the notion that Adam can ever truly be seen as male in a biological rather than a linguistic sense. The dam that flows from the animal sacrifices and from the women's menstruation is the same dam from which Adam is linguistically constructed, and the same dam that carries the life of the human being that reflects God's own image. Let's bring in two more Hebrew words here. Zachar, meaning male, and Nekeva, meaning female. And it may be helpful at this point to remember that ancient Israel was a place where people were not so separated from the unpleasantness of nature and biology as many of us might be today. Even with that warning, I still am not entirely comfortable pointing out that Nekeva is based on the verb for boring a hole. It's way too Freudian for me. Nevertheless, this is the aspect of femininity being expressed here. It's all about tunnels, holes, fertility, offspring, and the opening of wombs when the firstborn arrive. It is the same word used for animals and humans when it comes to defining biological sex. Likewise, Zachar can be used to denote the males of both humans and animals. Zachar has a second meaning, as it is also a verb which means to remember. Perhaps this adds a softer imagery of being remembered through offspring and descendants. Most modern scholars argue that these two meanings are completely separate homonyms, whereas some older scholars suggest a link between the two. It's hard to be clear as the two meanings seem to have existed in parallel across several ancient languages. However the separate meanings came into being, it's hard to hear the similarity between them and not recognize the way that the ability to produce descendants and being remembered play out together as core themes throughout the early books of the Bible. Yet despite this softer imagery, Zachar, like Nekeva, is still a word rooted primarily in genital identity. It seems to have some association with the meaning sharp. It's possible that both Zachar and Nekeva may on occasions be speaking more about those genitals than the creature who possesses them. I'll let you explore biblical texts for yourself to see how that might affect various passages. But for now, let's have a look at another couple of Hebrew words. Ish can be translated as either man or husband, and Isha can be translated as either woman or wife. Hebrew offers no linguistic distinction between the married and the unmarried options that we have in English, apart from perhaps the use of a possessive suffix, which makes them his or hers. We see this in Genesis 2:24, which many claim to be the first definition of marriage. Genesis 2:24 reads as follows: "Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." Here the man is not Adam but Ish, and the wife is Ishto. That's Isha in the masculine possessive construct form. We see here how Ish and Isha, in contrast to Zachar and Nekeva, are less about biology and anatomy and more about people and relationship. It's important to be aware of the slightly imbalanced choice that most translations make as a result of that possessive suffix. The usual translation of Ish and Ishto here is man and wife, when a more honest translation might be a man and his woman. We lack a real equivalent to these words in our language, and so it's difficult to translate them without prejudice. It is an almost paradoxical problem. If we assume marriage is there, then we find marriage in the possessive. But if we assume no marriage, then there is none to be found. In spite of Ish and Isha being words that are at least partly rooted in their relationship with each other, in Genesis 2:24, the Ish is already Ish before, or at least in the process of leaving his father and mother. So these meanings seem to exist somewhere between the meanings of man or husband and woman or wife. In Genesis 2:25, the verse after the Ish has joined with the Ishto, we have not Ish but Ha-Adam, and Ishto, his woman, being naked and unashamed. So we might ask, who is Ha-Adam in this verse? If the general rule of thumb is that Ish, a man, will join with his Isha, then does Ha-Adam here also represent a generalized sense of a man? Or does Ha-Adam still represent in some way that collective humanity of Genesis 1:27 that contained male and female? If Ha-Adam is in any way representing humanity when being paired with his Isha, then it calls into question to what extent the genders of Ish and Isha are literal or figurative. The pairing of Ha-Adam and Isha is also echoed in Genesis 2:23 when Ha-Adam makes the bone of my bone speak and names his partner Isha, woman, because she came from Ish, the man. Here there is no possessive ending, and so most translations call her woman, not wife. But this translation choice ends up masking the fact that the man from which she came in this verse is Ish and not Adam or Ha-Adam. So in Genesis 2:25, Ha-Adam, who has been linguistically used to represent the entirety of humanity's masculinity and femininity, is depicted in direct relationship with the feminine Isha. This perhaps suggests two things. Firstly, that Ish and Isha might sit closer to a modern sense of gender sexuality than the very biological Zakar and Nekeva, though I wouldn't want to push that notion further than a very gentle perhaps. But secondly, I think it shows that the culture and language of the Hebrew text is not entirely uncomfortable with the language that leaves space for some gender fluidity. And I think that probably leads us up quite neatly to start next time with the infamous texts of Leviticus.